So I'm giving you some additional insights from Matthew Vines and his re-release of his book, God and the Gay Christian, which was published last year in 2025. We're not looking at all the chapters. We're not looking at all the information. If you have interest in that, you can pick up the new edition, or the library has some of the older editions. But what we're going to do is look at one passage of scripture tonight, and then we're going to finish this study next Wednesday night. And if you find this interesting and helpful, I encourage you to look it up online and either get a copy, or I'm sure it will not be too long before this re-release will get to the library, and then you can look at some of the appendixes, which has a lot of this new research that I've been sharing with you. So tonight, what we're going to do is we are going to take a look at probably the most important reference in this whole discussion. That's in the book of Romans, chapter 1, and it's the passage of scripture that is very aggressive, and the Apostle Paul uses it very systematically in the book of Romans. And as we think back a couple of years back, we did a study on the book of Romans. And I mentioned then, but I want to reiterate it tonight, and that is most of the time we have primarily used Romans as a systematic theology and or a formula for salvation. I'm sure most people have been introduced to the Romans road, where it's the proof that everyone's a sinner and falls short of the glory of God, and that Christ died for our sins, and that we are justified and sanctified, and those type of things, those different themes that show up in the book. In chapter 1, when Paul begins to build a case that all people fall short of the glory of God, he begins to use language that then kind of becomes the tools that are used by anti-LGBTQ individuals as a way of condemning, especially condemning the gay community. And because of how these particular verses have been interpreted, it has led to a lot of different traumas in the life of the LGBT community. And it is really, in many ways, been taken as an over aggressive use of a particular point Paul is making out of a bigger point that he's making. And I think it's always important to understand what is this doing for Paul's overarching message. Is this a point that he's making to drive home the bigger point of idolatry, especially the Gentiles? And as a result of that, what we find is Paul is really setting everyone humbly before God in need of grace. This particular passage is often used even more so than the couple of Old Testament passages we looked at last week when we looked at the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and we talked a little bit about Leviticus and the term abominations. So
Hmm.
I want to remind you, in the study that we did a while back, the name of that study, and you can look it up on our YouTube if you want, it was called Rewind That. And the approach we took was to first take a look at the closing chapters of Romans first, and then double back and look at the preceding chapters, because it's in chapters 12 through 16 we see that the real context of what Paul is trying to do in the church at Rome is to try to get Jews and Gentiles to be unified, to forgive each other, and to carry on the work of Christ together. And when we go to chapters 12 through 16, he uses the term weak and strong as a way of setting this division and what needs to be done. The strong need to care for the weak, and the weak need to be considerate of the strong and meet together. And what Paul does is he uses a narrative approach using a lot of Old Testament citations in 9 through 11. And then he begins to uh, give a rebuttal in chapters 1 through 4 using some Old Testament citations that is really trying to get at the heart of this division. And finally, in chapters 5 through 8, Paul kind of maps out a lived out theology between these two groups and how they are to get along and to work together for the sake of the kingdom of God. So, if you go back and you look at this chart that was in the initial study that we looked at every chapter of the book of Romans, you'll find that it's important to understand that at the very end, we see what he's starting to do in chapter 1, and that is he's starting to humble first the Gentiles because of their idolatry. And then in chapter 2 of Romans, he begins to point toward the Jewish people and say, you think that you're better than the Gentiles. You're no better than they are. Everybody's on equal footing before the cross. And so, with that in mind, we come to this idea of kind of the rhetorical turn that Paul is making in Romans chapter 1. And it's a very strong rhetorical device that he's going to use in chapter 1 because every Jewish person that would hear Paul condemning these Gentiles, their idolatry, and some of the activity of their idolatry, they would be clapping wholeheartedly and saying, Paul, go get them because they are guilty. And then in chapter 2, he turns the spotlight on them and he begins to show that they are also as guilty and they are judgmental toward Gentiles, but they are as guilty as the Gentiles as well. So in chapter 2, there's kind of a change of pronouns from a third person to a second person. And what we find is he's asking three questions basically toward the Jewish people about their election, their privileges, and their priorities. He begins to confront them about boasting. And then he brings in Abraham in chapter 4 and talks about how Abraham was justified by faith. So that's kind of a review of that study that we did. And now we are going to introduce something that I mentioned a little bit in that study, but I think it's an important point to make. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to read, first of all, Romans chapter 1 out of the NIV, and then I want to read for you some portions out of the Wisdom of Solomon in chapter 14. So in chapter 1, here's where we are familiar with this passage. Beginning in verse 24 of Romans 1, it says, Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and they worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. And in the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what they ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They've invented ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents, and they have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. And although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. So you can see how aggressive Paul is in this passage, and he begins to talk about kind of the disorder of humanity. And what we find is he is echoing something that had come prior to his ministry. The Wisdom of Solomon is one of the apocryphal books that sit between the Old and the New Testament. And when you read Romans 1, and then you read a passage out of the Wisdom of Solomon, you're going to find very similar parallels there. So I want to read that for you in the book of the Wisdom of Solomon. It says this. Here is a lengthy passage, but I will pick some parts out. I don't think we need to read the whole thing. So in this passage, it says, "For the idea of making idols was the beginning of fornication." Interesting connection there. "And the invention of them was the corruption of life, for they did not exist from the beginning, nor will they last forever. For through human vanity they entered the world, and therefore their speedy end has been planned." So here is this idea of idolatry, the making of idols. He goes on down, and when you pick up later in the same chapter, verse 22 through 31, here's what it says. And try to listen for the parallels here. "Then it was not enough for them to err about the knowledge of God, but though living in great strife due to ignorance, they call such great evils peace. For whether they kill children in their initiations, or celebrate secret mysteries, or hold frenzied revels with strange customs, they no longer keep either their lives or their marriages pure, but they either treacherously kill one another or grieve one another by adultery. And all is a raging riot of blood and murder and theft, deceit, corruption, faithlessness, tumult, perjury, confusion over what is good, forgetfulness of favors, defiling of souls, sexual perversion, disorder in marriages, adultery, and debauchery. For the worship of idols not to be named is the beginning and cause and end of every evil. For their worshippers either crave in exaltation, or prophesy lies, or live unrighteously, or readily commit perjury. For because they trust in lifeless idols, they swear wicked oaths and expect to suffer no harm. But just penalties will overtake them on 2 counts, because they thought wrongly about God in devoting themselves to idols, and because in deceit they swore unrighteously through contempt for holiness. For it is not the power of the things by which people swear, but it is the just penalty for those who sin, that always pursues the transgression of the unrighteous." So what the Wisdom of Solomon is doing is it is beginning to connect idolatry and sexual perversion. And that is kind of what Paul is getting at in Romans chapter 1. And it's important to see that connection, because this is not really talking about same gender love relationships. It's talking about a connection to idolatry. And as a result of that, there's kind of confusion over what is good. And there is the temptation to turn idolatry into moral corruption, whether it is social or sexual in nature. And when you make that connection and you begin to see that he's riffing on something that has come before, I think we better understand what Romans chapter 1 is all about. I think Paul is setting up a trap here, because the Jewish critique of idolatry was very strong. And as a result, it kind of reinforced their sense of moral superiority. But Paul is not writing in isolation. He's using a critique not only of idolatry, but paganism as well.
And he's going to show in chapter 1 that when you worship what is not true, the collapse of humanity comes as a result of that. So, in many ways, both the Wisdom of Solomon and Romans chapter 1 is very philosophical on how people perceive God can cascade into disordered thinking, desire, and behavior. And if we keep that, I think, in the back of our mind, when we read Romans chapter 1, we will begin to see that this is not an account necessarily attacking one group of people. It is trying to show the stupidity of idolatry. And what Paul is really trying to do is, at least in this section, turn Gentiles away from idols because it's folly and toward the one true God. That then becomes the setup that will bring condemnation not only to Gentiles, but to Jewish people as well, because they sit in judgment on the Gentiles. So when we read in chapter 1 of Romans, turning away from God, the Gentiles worship idols instead. Now, the Jewish people had their own track record on this in the Old Testament. They pursued idolatry. We've mentioned several times that even though in the Old Testament it moves toward the idea of monotheism, the belief and worship of one true God, but it takes a while to get there. And you see different stories in the Old Testament where there is still the pursuit of idolatry, even though they kind of put Yahweh as the head of their pantheon of gods that they would worship and trust in. So by the time you get to the New Testament, they're moving closer and closer to monotheism. In the older portions of the Old Testament, it's monolatry, and that is they believe in Yahweh as the supreme God while they worship other gods as well. So really, the Jews are just as guilty as the Gentiles in all of this. Now, what's interesting is what Paul does. When I read Romans chapter 1 a moment ago, it was not just male and with male relationship or female with female relationship that is listed. If you listen close, Paul lists 21 different vices in that short passage there. And it is really everything that kind of descends from having misplaced priorities. And so he'll bring condemnation upon gossips and slanderers and the insolent and the boastful, and a whole bunch of different things are mentioned there. To zero in only on one thing in this passage and to ignore the other is to miss Paul's rhetorical argument in the first part of Romans. And ultimately, what it is showing is that there is kind of a decline of civilization when you worship false gods or worship idols. And that's always been the case, and it's still the case when we worship money or power or violence or whatever it may be that is an idol that is more important than loving the one true God. Civilization suffers as a result of it. So the reason for Paul's condemnation here is, um, first of all, clumping all humanity together to show that all of humanity is guilty and in need of grace. Now, we come to the point at hand for the evening, and that is when Paul talks about same-sex relationship, it is very negative, and that's indisputable. All we had to do is listen to the text. But what we need to do is understand whether he's talking about the same thing in his day as what we're talking about in our day. So, in this paragraph, the behavior that is being described is lustful in nature. You have no mention of love or fidelity, monogamy, commitment. And so right there is a difference that's taking place. If someone in a same-sex relationship, whether it is a male or female, uh, seems to get swept up by Paul in this condemnation, but we ignore the fact that it misses a lot of the things that Paul exalts in other letters, like 1 Corinthians 13, love, and all the qualities of love and so forth. So when we talk about using Romans 1 as a powerful condemnation of the LGBTQ community, we have to ask this question. Is that a faithful application of this text today? Does this paragraph apply to all same-sex relationships or just lustful, fleeting, the type that is using someone else and misusing someone else? So what is Paul's moral logic here is an important question to ask. And when you look at the parallels here, you go, why would Paul place murder in parallel to a same-sex relationship? Really? Are they on the same level? So that then causes us to kind of focus on this idea of natural versus unnatural in the text. And it seems as though that's connected to some customary things that took place in ancient Greece as well as Roman society. We also have to ask this one other question. Is this only a reference to male-female genitalia in complementary terms? Remember, we talked about that in previous weeks, that one argument is the genitalia of a male and female, they fit together. So that's the only way God honors a relationship and so forth. So let's dive in. Now, one interpretation that has come about is, are these straight people who have gotten caught up in excess of sexuality so that they are experimenting with same-sex behavior? They're heterosexual, but they have exchanged or abandoned their natural state to go on a bender of same-sexual activity. So that's one approach that has been looked at and researched. And how does that square with the ancient belief that, remember last week we talked about how in the ancient world, it was believed that people were capable of being attracted both to males and females at the same time. So there's much more a bisexual orientation in the ancient world than what we would talk about in our day. So Paul seems to be saying here that there's some latent desires that people have, and they act upon them. And researchers are also asking that when someone comes out strong against same-sex relationships, is there some projection that is going on there, that they're trying to fight their own inner battle of their inquisitiveness and curiosity of that type of relationship? So philosophically, psychologically is a way of thinking about that. But in the last 10 years, I think more and more researchers are saying this is not a loving relationship between two same-gendered individuals. This is a condemnation of excess passion. Um, Same-sex relationships, as you see on the screen, in the first century were not thought to be the expression of an exclusive sexual orientation. They just didn't think that way. Am I straight or am I gay? They saw same-sex behavior in some settings as kind of a product of excessive sexual desire. And because they didn't think of people as gay or straight, um, when in moderation, that type of relationship was okay. But when it went over the top, in excess, then it became a liability and it became a vice. So same-sex attraction was seen as common, but what Paul seems to be referring to here is something over the top, something excessive that is connected again to idolatry. So I'm going to give you some examples of this. So in the ancient world, some of this type of excess passion has been mentioned by some of the ancient historians. One of them is by the name of Suetonius. He's a Roman centurion, not centurion, historian rather. He's a Roman historian that wrote a lot about the history of Rome and some of the rulers of Rome. And this is what he wrote about the Emperor Galba. He said about him, he was more inclined toward men. So he seemed to have a same sex attraction toward men, but at the same time, he still married a woman and he had children. So this was his attraction, but the convention of a ruler was to produce offspring and to produce future heirs to the throne. Suetonius also described the poet Virgil. Maybe you've heard of him before. He said about him, he was more inclined toward boys, but also recounted Virgil's affair with a woman at the same time. So there seems to be both sides that are being played in some individuals' lives. And possibly that's a part of what Paul is talking about as well. So, one thing to keep in mind is that ancient sexual labels are important to understand for our understanding of the text. So, labels were based upon whether someone was seen as deviating from their appropriate gender role. Now, what is that? Well, for men, it was to be dominant, it was to have authority and strength. For women, it was supposed to be submissive, servant like. Now, there were terms that later were introduced in not in Greek, but in Latin, which obviously was part of the Roman Empire. In Latin, a man viewed as submissive rather than dominant had a special name, synedeus. A woman who was not submissive but was dominant was often called a tribus. So in Latin, there seems to be some special terms that were used for people that didn't stay in their appropriate gender role. And these terms seem to refer in the ancient writings by Suetonius and others that there were certain men that were submissive in a relationship with other men. And as a result, they would go on and they would talk about men who desired to be penetrated by other men and women who took the dominant role in the sexual relationship. So this is also true with two women as well. So the link here seems to be kind of gender deviant forms of same-sex behavior that wasn't appropriate to the gender roles of that time. So Suetonius, same historian, uh, castigated Julius Caesar. Now, talk about going against the strong man here for being unbridled and extravagant in his sexual escapades. The excessive behavior led the elder Curio to quip that Caesar was also every woman's man and every man's woman. Think about that for a moment. That he took the opposite gender role than what was to be accepted in its time. Every woman's man, he took the submissive side, and every man's woman, he also took the kind of authoritative side as well. So he kind of went between two extremes. Now, this continues on. So, what Paul does in Romans chapter 1 kind of sets a trail that other church fathers follow. And I've listed some here for you. The early church fathers got onto Paul's bandwagon. So Clement of Alexandria wrote that luxury made men prone to same-sex behavior. Interesting comment. In the 4th century, Basil of Caesarea focused on gluttony as the root of sexual sin. So he's drawing a parallel there of the inability to control impulses. So he drew a parallel that anyone that might be tempted to overeat was also tempted to engage in same-sex behavior. Now, this is kind of going off the rails a little bit. In the 4th century, Bishop John Chrysostom maintained that the whole desire comes from an excess which cannot contain itself. And finally, Martin Luther went even farther, and he says that Satan blots out natural desire and stirs up same-sex desire. So same-sex behavior in the ancient world, though, also included things that we had mentioned before about pederasty, prostitution, and sex. Sometimes that would take place between masters and slaves. And it seems as though Paul is focusing on excessive behavior that is somehow connected to idolatry. So here's what I want you to notice. So here's that passage again out of Romans, and I've highlighted here 5 different Greek terms that are used in these 4 verses. Let me read it again. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their heart to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies. That's term number 1 there, epithemia, desire. It implies an aggressive, irregular type of desire. He goes on, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, worshiped and served created things rather than Creator. Goes back to Genesis. There's a connection to Genesis there, that God is the Creator who's forever praised. Amen. Second term, verse 26. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. That's the term pathos, which can be translated passion, shameful, passion out of control, an ungoverned aspect of desire. Then it goes on, even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. Then in verse 27, you have the final 3 terms. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even the women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. And in the same way, so there's a parallel that's being drawn to the women in the previous verse. Again, remember, verse notations do not come until much later. So this would just read one sentence after another without the break of verse notations in Paul's letter. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed. Ekaio, inflamed, to set on fire, something that consumes something else. With lust, orexis, which has the idea of appetite, an appetite for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error, plane, error, kind of a wandering deceit, deception, delusion. There's not a lot of honest relationships with integrity toward other people in this paragraph. There's a lot of control and manipulation that is going on by the use of these key terms. So what do we do? Well, there are 3 scholars in the last 10 years that really have addressed this. One by the name of Fredrickson, another by the name of Gagnon, and the other by the name of Brownson. And you can look at their training, each of them. I'm going to designate them as A, B, and C. So A is Fredrickson, B is Gagnon, and C is Brownson. When we look back in the next couple of slides of what they're thinking, you'll know who's being referred to. And I'm going to show you a picture of the 3 authors here in a moment. But they all have different training, which is interesting. Fredrickson
His training emphasis was in the Greco-Roman context and rhetoric, and he had primarily an ancient moral philosophy as his way of looking at the text. He really stresses contextual um, uh, focus, and in this case, the focus on desire and excess. Gagnon is kind of the more fundamental individual focused on biblical theology, the original language in the Greek. He will do some canonical and Jewish background work and research, but his emphasis is on the created order because in the text there is a mention back to the creator. So there's some thinking there about Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And then Brownson, his training was in New Testament theology and ethics, and his emphasis was on moral logic and application. And he too was very contextual, but feels that the text is also constructive for us today, not just back in the first century. So here's the picture of these three guys. David Fredrickson was a professor and is professor emeritus of New Testament at Luther Seminary. He wrote a book called The Promise of Not Knowing, a New Testament reading, which came out in 2022. And his emphasis is uncontrolled excessive desire that disrupts social and moral disorder. Then Robert A.J. Gagnon was professor of New Testament at Houston Baptist University. He wrote a book in 2002 called The Bible and Homosexual Practice, Texts and Hermeneutics, and he talks about the condemnation of all same-sex relationships and intercourse as a violation of God's design. Then the third author, James V. Brownson, professor of New Testament at Western Theological Seminary, wrote a book in 2013 called Bible, Gender, Sexuality, Reframing the Church's Debate on Same-Sex Relationships. And his emphasis was on people acting against their assumed heterosexual nature. In other words, these are heterosexuals that are involved in homosexual activity, but they're heterosexual by nature and they do what's unnatural simply because of their lust and desire. Okay, so now let's take line by line of this passage, and then A, B, C is how each of them would look at that. So again, you're looking at Fredrickson, Gagnon, and Brownson. So God gave them over. So Fredrickson would say a rhetorical move showing escalating disorder as a result of a loss of self-mastery. In other words, unable to control themselves. Gagnon would say God actively hands people over as punishment. Okay, if that's what you want to pursue, I'm letting you go and you just live with the consequences. People like this would talk about things like AIDS being a punishment for their activity, that's that type of thing. Then Brownson would say it's part of a larger narrative about idolatry and how that whole problem of idolatry distorts and disrupts human relationships. So God gave them over in desires and lusts. Fredrickson said that's uncontrolled passion. Gagnon says desire is sinful because it seeks what's inherently wrong. And then Brownson would say it emphasizes lustful excess, not committed relationships. So now here's what's going to happen. You can see how three different authors will take the same passage and will derive different conclusions from this. And that's the frustration of Bible interpretation. The same passage can have multiple meanings depending upon what is being emphasized. So here they exchanged the glory of God for idols. And so Fredrickson would say God and idols here. Uh, uh, Gagnon would say it's a rejecting of God's design, male and female complementary.
And then Bronson would say acting against one's own assumed heterosexual nature. They exchanged what? Their natural, their natural position, their natural use, their natural function. So Fredrickson would say they exchange socially expected or customary norms for that which is not customary. The next author, again, he's concentrating primarily on biological and creation design, male and female. And then the last author is uh, one's own embodied experience. And you are veering away from that embodied experience to pursue something that does not come naturally to you. Now that works both ways, right? So if someone is heterosexual, their natural assumption is an attraction to the opposite sex. For someone that is homosexual or gay, their attraction is to someone of the same gender, and to force that individual to be in a relationship with someone of an opposite gender, unless they're bisexual, is really unnatural for them. And that's what these authors then talk about. It's against nature. Um, Fredrickson says it's socially unconventional. It's not metaphysically wrong. It's a social convention that is being violated here. Gagnon would say it's intrinsically immoral, and Bronson would say it's against one's own personal assumed nature. They burned in their desire. Okay, so runaway passion versus intense desire for what is wrong versus excessive lust. Male with males, excessive social transgressive behavior versus universal reference to make same sex intercourse sinful, or exploitive and expressive expressions, as we see Bronson talking about. This is not a natural relationship. This is a coercive relationship. It's against nature, socially unconventional, metaphysically wrong, not metaphysically wrong, versus intrinsically immoral, violating God's created order, versus against one's own personal um, position, natural position. Shameless acts. Fredrickson would say this is the language of an honor shame culture, that they're not keeping their assumed gender roles like they should. Um, Gagnon would talk about it being just moral guilt, moral shamefulness. And then the last author, Bronson, would talk about it being dishonor within a cultured gender framework. And then the due penalty. Now, what is that? Well, Fredrickson would say there are internal consequences when it's excessive behavior. You can't control yourself. Gagnon would say, no, it's an external punishment. God's is out to judge these people. Bronson would say it's just the natural consequences when when you make bad decisions. The Book of Proverbs would call this foolishness. You live out the consequences of that type of foolishness. So when we look at all of these interpretive options here, what we find is that in the last 10 years, Romans chapter 1 has been looked at in a variety of different ways by people that have a variety of different research skills. Now, it only makes the topic more difficult. It really doesn't clarify it. But if we can keep the original context in mind that we talked about at the beginning, that what Paul is doing is setting up the Gentiles so that he can then do a rhetorical turn on the Jews so that all of humanity can see that they need the one true God and not the idols that they pursue. So in the last 10 years, there's not a lot of uniformity in the way that you find a study of this text. We find that there is, in the text, it does not share modern classifications, that we use.
homosexual, lesbian, bisexual, and all those other terms that are a part of this conversation. Natural is more about customary uh, and socially fitting behavior more than biology. And it's pertaining to the first century primarily. The focus is on excess and the loss of self control. Exchange language signals kind of a moral disorder, not an orientation that a person has, that certain types of decisions and behaviors lead to disorder in society. And that's kind of the main point. And most of the scholars now are beginning to see that this plays an important role in what Paul is doing to set up all of society as in need of God's grace. And so you're going to find more viewpoints than these three, but these three seem to be the most dominant in the last decade. So I will stop our recording at this time, and we will come back together and see if this makes any sense to you or if I lost you in the weeds somewhere. Any thoughts, any questions?
Years ago, when I was studying all this, I don't remember which book I read it in, but the author in that book pointed out that this passage referred to entire families having sex with the priest of Baal to ensure fertility.
Hmm. Now, Baal is more of an Old Testament idol, but there would be lingering pantheons that would still be worshipped on into the New Testament era. More than Baal, I would think that this type of behavior might be linked more to Roman gods, but
Okay.
yeah. So, yeah, well, we do know that there was temple prostitution was a common thing. So, I mean, it seems as though that there are connections there, and especially since the whole paragraph seems to be connected to idolatry, that all of these behaviors, not just sexually, but everything from murder to everything else that's listed there, uh, kind of shows confusion and of people that are following after other gods that do not uphold the moral character of Yahweh or the God of Jesus, that idea. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. I really do, because we know there were temple prostitutes in the in Ephesus, and in the worship of Artemis and things like that. So that they're that very and Paul was very connected to Ephesus as well, even before writing the book of Romans, even though Romans comes immediately after the book of Acts, it's not written, that's not chronological. He you know he probably wrote Romans at a different point in time, uh, and after he had visited, I think it's in Acts chapter 16. I'd have to look that up, where there's the big riot that takes place in Ephesus because Paul goes into Ephesus and is evangelizing, and they're upset that it's going to upset the economic um, welfare of the city because you're going to turn people away from worshiping idols. And you can look that up. I think it's Acts chapter 16. Which, yeah. So, other thoughts?
Well, temple prostitution was pretty acceptable. I mean, clear back into the Old Testament, Judas slept with what he thought was a temple prostitute,
Right.
and there was really that was no problem.
Yeah.
No issue. If he hadn't got his daughter-in-law pregnant,
Yeah.
it would have been no issue. But then it became a little bit of an issue. But
Yeah. Well, and she disguised herself too. So I mean, was one of those things, but I'm not excusing them. I'm just saying that's an interesting story.
Yeah, it is, but I mean, the whole idea of temple prostitution, I mean, that was really no problem.
Yeah, yeah,
It
you're
just
right.
it resulted in a funny story,
Yeah.
you know, but yeah, so temple prostitution was going on for thousands of years.
And that would be fully acceptable in the New Testament era by uh, idolaters that are worshiping Roman gods and that type of thing. It's only when Christ comes and people's hearts are changed because he introduces God as Abba Father and the one true God, the creator of everything and stuff, that it becomes a problem because there's a connection now um, to being faithful in service to this one true God. And so to be a follower of Jesus was to upset the economic and social apple cart, of the day. Other ideas or thoughts? So here's my point. In this ongoing debate, there is a lot, I mean, a whole lot of stuff that's going on here. It's not as simple, God created Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve. That's just simplistic, cartoonish type of thinking, okay? So we have to understand other people will land on the other side of this issue. But those of us who know and love people that are part of the LGBTQ community know to the depths of our soul that each is dearly, dearly loved by God and his people, and it's not until you get up close and personal with other people that you begin to put a face and a story to this topic. And I think I still am very sad that people can take things and just make it a theoretical straw man rather than seeing it as a very personal thing. So, anyways, that's my 2 cents on that. But any other things that you have?
I heard I missed a good concert the other night.
Well, we had some fun. I had an opportunity
Good.
to sing a couple of songs and so yeah.
You have to let us know when you're going to do it again.
Yeah, I don't know when that'll happen.
Yeah, yeah.
Denny over at the Willoughby Fine Arts, he does it a couple times a year where and what he's really doing is kind of showing some of his students, he's showing them off a little bit in their
Mhm.
musical ability and stuff. But then he invites friends that, to
Mhm.
participate as well and stuff. So I think if you go to Estee's Facebook, I think she posted one of the
Yeah,
videos.
she did. Yeah,
He
So,
yeah,
did. Yeah.
yeah.
so there's another one that she could post, but she didn't because it's a song that I might end up doing at Brent and Angela's wedding. So that's why
Oh,
she didn't post that one.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Should. That's a good song.
but anyways, the stuff that if you go to Denny Carlton, you'll see he posts only his original stuff from
Mhm.
that concert up there, so he doesn't violate any copyright stuff. So,
Right.
yeah, but anyways, yeah, it was fun.
Mhm.
I'd do it again.
Good, good.
All right. Anything else?
No.
No. I am going to be at McKinley tomorrow. I don't have to
Okay,
work
good,
on it, so
I'll
good.
be there.
okay. Sounds
You'll be
good.
there?
I'll be there.
Okay, good.
All righty.
Okay.
Everybody, have a great evening, and
Thank
hope you
you.
enjoy the rest of the week.
Too.
And, hey, go Cavs tomorrow night. All right.
Yeah.
Better,
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Good night,
night.
You
everybody.
one
Bye.
more and that's it.